Our next guest is one of Australia's leading expert commentators on housing, and he's got a plan to fix our so-called housing crisis, which he says is actually only affecting a small proportion of Aussies and can be dealt with quite easily. Dr. Cameron Murray is an economist and founder of the think tank Fresh Economic Thinking. He says that the housing policy debate has been hijacked by interest groups, and he says we're sailing further away from workable solutions rather than towards them. He's written a book about it called The Great Housing Hijack, the hoaxes and myths that are keeping prices high for renters and buyers in Australia. Cameron Murray joined me for an in-studio interview, which we pre-recorded earlier in the week. Cameron, thanks very much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me, Damian.
So you've got an interesting thesis here. Let's define the problem firstly as you see it. You say that there's hoaxes and myths going on, that vested interests are pulling the strings in the property market. Who are these vested interests and why are they pulling the strings?
Yeah, to be clear, in the housing debate, I'm arguing the debate is hijacked, and that's because certain interest groups have an interest in keeping property prices and rents high. Every property owner, every landlord, they love higher rents and they love higher prices. But on the flip side, the cost to that is the higher rents paid by, mum and dad renters, we could call them. And so I think the way we structure our debate is that we sort of forget the flip side. We forget that there's a cost to every benefit for renters, and every cost to a renter is a benefit from a landlord. And I think if we can acknowledge that, we can move on the debate on. Whereas what we're doing is we're sort of avoiding that. We're sort of avoiding that taboo, I call it, issue in housing, that a benefit for a renter is a cost for a landlord. And if we can't navigate this issue, we'll keep going round in circles in what I call the hijacked housing debate.
Okay, so nobody's to blame, right? It's just the reality of the situation.
Reality. Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. We've got 2/3 of households are property owners, 18% of households are landlords. Just about every politician, maybe bar one, at the state and federal level is a landlord of some sort. And of course, they have interests financially in supporting, high prices in the property market and avoiding taxing property and things like that. And so when you have that situation, it's only the natural outcome to, how would I put it, signal your concern for renters by saying, yeah, we care about affordable housing, but in reality not wanting to devalue your biggest assets.
Right.
And that's the tension we're facing, and that's the thing we can't push through in the public debate, that affordable housing means cheap housing, means people who own property are going to bear the cost of that.
So just to get this right, Cameron, you're basically saying that if there wasn't government intervention to keep prices going up, then we would have, or at least maintain, or favourable policy for the prices, that we'd see an asset price correction.
Not specifically. Look, we had a long history prior to what we'd call government intervention in taxes and regulation in housing, right? All through the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s, and do you know what we had? Very expensive housing. My favourite quote comes from Charles Darwin in 1836, right? He visited Sydney on the HMS Beagle.
The Charles Darwin.
The Charles Darwin, father of evolutionary theory. And his diary entry on his first day says, "The number of large homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house."
Okay.
So what I'm sort of getting at is this is a more natural outcome of markets, but we did have a period, a post-World War period from the 50s and 60s where we had intervention to help solve housing. We actually got home ownership up from around 43% in the metropolitan areas to 71% in 2 decades after the war. And we did that by subsidising people into home ownership. I mean, Menzies was famously pushing for little capitalists.
Yep.
So he didn't see it as socialism of subsidising people into homes.
Yep.
He saw it as, well, I'm creating more capitalists, but the cost of getting that is subsidising people into homes.
Of government intervention. And
correct.
I mean, purist libertarians are watching the show might not like this, but the reality is, and most of our classical liberal viewers would admit, you've got to have some government intervention sometimes to push things along or get things started. And, housing is something that I suppose, you know, it's obviously got that social component more strongly than a lot of other markets, and so we've got to be careful about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, can you just summarise for me what the cause is? I mean, the situation we've got now is high prices.
Well,
everybody's saying it's just a market gone crazy. It's foreign money coming in. What's really going on?
well, I think we need to zoom out a little. We've got the same situation happening in Canada, the US, Europe, across Asia, in New Zealand, and every city I go to, I get people come up to me and they say, Cameron, we're the worst for this, aren't we? Our housing market's the worst. And I said, well, you know what's funny? Every city I go to, people think that. So I think we're dealing with a normal outcome of property markets where during a boom period, prices and rents rise rapidly, but that process leaves people behind. And what we're not doing is working on non-market ways to support those people who are getting left behind. And that's only a small portion of the population, right? When I go on my book tours, I get people to put their hand up in the audience. I say, who are the homeowners here? Put your hands up. Keep them up if you're having a housing crisis. They all put their hands down. I'm like, okay, so we've got all this talk about a housing crisis. Get the renters to put their hand up. Who's having a housing crisis? Most of them put their hand down too. I'm like, okay, so we're actually only dealing maybe 10% of the households who are having a crisis.
Right.
Why can't we just directly support them?
It's another one of these media beat up crises, right? Or just a community hysteria.
Yeah, well, one of the points I make in the book is when prices are rising, it's a crisis for people who don't own houses, but a boom for those who do. Prices are falling, it's a crisis for those who own houses, but a boom for those who don't because they get in cheap.
Are asset prices inflated though? Are housing prices in the residential markets in Australia in need of correction?
It's a little bit more subtle than that actually, Damian, because if we go back 2 years when interest rates were 2%, asset prices in housing make a lot of sense at 2%. But what we've actually tried to do, and we overlook this fact, is we manage the macroeconomy through housing. We've put interest rates up to make it more difficult to buy a home. That was the intended outcome. Make it more difficult to build a home. And now we're getting that outcome and everyone's saying, no, this is terrible.
The outcome we look for.
So we need to always zoom out and think about the long-term context. And that's true also when we think about what policies we want to do to change the outcome. We need to think about more long-term, what's worked elsewhere, what's worked in the past, and acknowledge that the market's going to do its boom and bust cycles and we're going to be in this situation again. This situation today reminds me a lot of the late 2000s, you know, from 2006 to 2008. Rents were rising rapidly, interest rates were rising. We're all complaining about housing. And then in the early 2010s, housing was quite reasonably affordable in most cities.
Now, in a recent interview you did on the Discernible platform with Matt Wong, Matt mentioned about a $9 million house that was sold in Sydney in the inner suburbs. I mean, are you saying that that's the market? I mean, that's the reality. If someone's going to pay that much, that's what the house is worth.
Well, this is the thing. Do we like the market outcome or do we not, right? Because the seller of that house likes the market outcome. And I think it's reasonable. Like, we do need that flexibility in the housing system. We need people to speculate on it. We need people to fail and go bust if they pay $9 million and it's worth $5 million in 5 years' time. But not everyone can participate and put that money at risk. We still need places to live. We need security of those places. We don't want to have to be squeezed out. And I think this is where the heart of the problem is. It's not that housing's expensive or cheap, it's that some people, when prices rise, can't keep up with everyone else.
Okay, and you're saying
they're getting squeezed, they have to move, they're becoming homeless. That is the issue we need to address, and we need to sidestep the market outcome to help that, because the market's not going to solve that problem by itself.
So your solution's quite interesting, because you're saying that's affecting about 10% of people. You're basically saying we need to split the social problem from the free market. Take the free market 90% and leave it alone. Take the 10% and take care of them, like the safety net.
Yeah, now you're getting it, because a lot of the conversation
we're having. No. Get there.
You're telling me. I love hearing people tell me the conclusion I came to, and I'm like, yes.
Excellent. That's my job. Just to summarise it for you.
Yeah, we've got this debate where we're trying to engineer. Low rents and prices for 11 million dwellings in the market. We don't need to do that. We only need to get around 1 million dwellings and offer them to people outside the market, right? To offer that security to that small part of the whole population who gets really badly affected when prices and rents change rapidly.
Okay. So how do we do that in a way that, would sort of be respectful of the market and not distort or pervert the market in any way? Well, not that we're not distorting it or perverting it at the moment, but I mean, how would we do that?
Yeah, so a lot of what we talk about is, should we tax property more? Should we give grants for this? Should we change the way we lend money? These are all sort of good questions, but we have the same housing problem in, for example, New Zealand, that doesn't have stamp duty on property trades. And we have the same property problems in Europe and the United States that have very different regulations on property. So we can talk about that, but fundamentally, this problem of people left behind when the market booms, that's still happening everywhere. The places it doesn't happen are those that either have very, very high home ownership, right? Because home ownership insulates you from, you don't have to pay more rent if the rent goes up. I actually say home ownership is the greatest form of rent control, because your landlord never puts your rent up, right? And so historically in Australia, one way we did it is we subsidised people into home ownership. We had state governments very, very active in housing development, and the federal government very active in subsidising mortgages, and that's how we got that extra 20% of people into home ownership. I look at places like Singapore that got home ownership from 20% to 88% in 3 decades, right, by subsidising people into home ownership.
That was very state-controlled, top-down,
it's very state-controlled
system, right, for Singapore. I mean, it is. It's a socialist country with a capitalist overlay, right?
Well, all countries are like that to some degree, right? We've just got to pick and choose where we let the market, flourish and take those outcomes, and where we want to intervene. That's, I think, the political judgment, and we do that everywhere. So, and Australia, got high home ownership by subsidising it. So I think one way to do it is what I call housemate, which is essentially a public home ownership option. So renters can essentially get a subsidised home, but instead of like a first homeowners grant, giving them the cash and they can turn around and sell it at the market price, you make them resell back into the system of other qualifying buyers. So that sort of keeps this parallel subsidised system at a lower price, and people who aren't satisfied with the market, which is not that many people when we really think about what the issue is, can shift out. It's like a relief valve, a pressure relief valve for the market.
So the problem with first home buyer grants and tax policies and things like those sorts of interventions across the whole market is that you get these market distortions and perversions, and eventually it just builds into the cost. And if you know that they can pay $7,000 more because the government's given it, and the price goes up $7,000, so it's kind of all cancelled out. But what you're saying is we need to create a separate market, if you like, that you can only sell back into that social market, that safety net market of that 10%.
Correct. And you build that up over 10 or 15 years. And then next time we're having this booming rents like we're having right now, instead of 30% of households having to outbid each other and pay the higher rent, maybe we're down to 15% of households. And they're the more mobile, high-income households, not those ones that just want to stay put where they are and pay a steady rent because their kids are at school. Well, they'll have the option to get out into something more stable and secure. So when I look around the world, those types of broad social housing options are what keeps working class people in the cities during boom times. And I'm a bit agnostic on how you operate it. I want the most efficient, simplest administration possible. But if I just can't see any other way of helping those people. And
we can't have people living in cars in a country this wealthy. We've got to fix that problem. And
that's right.
This might be the way to do it without messing with the free market too much.
That's right. And I think it's a dead end to have a political debate about, we're going to fix housing by crushing everyone's house prices or all this sort of stuff. Well, let's think that through a little bit more, right?
There's no incentive.
This is the hijacked housing debate. We go around in circles. We've used those higher incomes that we've got. We've had inflation, so everyone, cost of everything's gone up. The household incomes have gone up, and housing's one dimension. And the problem, of course, again, happening globally, a lot of people's incomes haven't kept up with others. And now they're getting outbid for their locations, and they're getting squeezed out of the cities or squeezed into tents and, sleeping on the couch at the relatives.
Yeah. Cameron, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Great to talk to you. And the book, just remind us once again, The Great
Housing Hijack. It's available everywhere, all good bookstores.
We've got it up on screen now. Also available as an ebook, no doubt.
Of course.
All right, the great housing hijack. And if people want to get in touch with you, you have a website?
Fresheconomicthinking.com is my website. You can subscribe for free and follow all my writing about housing and all other economic topics.
Great. Okay, so we need a two-tiered system, a social system for the 10%, and leave perhaps less market intervention for the other 90%, and that should work okay.
Yeah, I think next cycle, when we look back, we'll say, this is much better than what happened last time in terms of housing.
All right. Thanks very much for your time, Cameron. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Damian.